In the depths of Colorado's frozen wilderness, rangers tracked a trail they couldn't explain, paws too big for a bobcat, too graceful for a dog. But the truth was stranger than fiction. A lost German Shepherd pup, abandoned by humans, had been raised in silence by 3 wild lynxes. They didn't chase him off. They raised him as one of their own. He didn't learn to bark. He learned to prowl, to climb, to vanish like smoke. But when wildfire struck and tore his only family apart, he faced an impossible choice: follow his instincts or return to a world that had once left him behind. This is the story of Rusty the shepherd who was never meant to survive, and the family that taught him what survival really means. The storm rolled over the jagged ridgelines of the San Juan Mountains like a living thing, a colossal beast cloaked in thunder and sleet. Trees bent beneath the weight of ice, and wind howled through the ravines, scattering snow across the high-altitude forests of southern Colorado. It was late October, and Telluride, the nearest town nestled in the basin miles below, had emptied its hiking trails for the season. The forest, now a vast expanse of silence and snow, belonged to shadows. On a steep slope carved by time and wind, a flash of movement stirred beneath the white blur. 3 lynxes, silent, muscular, and carved from the wilderness itself, moved like phantoms through the storm. The leader, Ash, was a female of considerable size and authority. Her fur, pale silver with subtle streaks of black, rippled as she bounded from boulder to snowdrift. Her golden eyes held a wild, calculating calm, the kind born of years surviving the merciless alpine winters. Beside her, Bristle followed closely, a male with ragged tufts around his ears and a heavy scar across his left flank, a remnant of a past fight with a mountain lion. Bristle was cautious, the watcher among them. The youngest Creek was barely out of adolescence, leaner, quicker, often overzealous but loyal to Ash's every movement. The trio had been returning from a high-ground perch when Ash stopped abruptly near a runoff stream, swollen with meltwater and storm debris. The water roared against ice-slick stones, wild and unforgiving. At the edge, tangled in the roots of a blown-over spruce, was a huddled shape, a pup motionless, soaked to the bone, barely visible against the snow-muddied earth. Ash advanced slowly, her breath steaming in the frigid air. She circled the creature once, then twice. The pup's eyes fluttered open, not in fear, but in the dull fog of exhaustion. It was no wild thing. A German shepherd, or a mix just weeks old with dark sable fur, streaked in tan and soaked through to the skin. One ear flopped, while the other half perked in weak confusion. His belly was sunken, his ribs faint beneath his coat. Despite everything, he did not flinch or growl. He simply stared up at Ash, blinking against the snowflakes clinging to his lashes. Bristle approached next ears, twitching, emitting a low growl deep in his chest. Creek hovered farther back, eyes wide, uncertain. This was not their kind, not a cub, not prey. An intruder perhaps left behind by humans or worse, bait for hunters. But Ash did not strike. She did not bare teeth. Instead, she leaned forward and touched her cold, wet nose to the pup's muzzle. He shivered, but didn't retreat. A decision passed through her gaze. Ash turned her head, gave a low, vibrating chirp, and nudged the pup with her forehead. Bristle huffed. Creek tilted his head, but both followed when Ash gently seized the nape of the pup's neck in her teeth and began dragging him up the slope back to their shelter in a hidden stone outcrop beneath a dense canopy of black pine and aspen. At the same time, farther down the valley, a pair of headlights cut through the murky dusk. A 4-wheel-drive vehicle rumbled along a Forest Service road, tires crunching on the frozen gravel. Inside sat Zachary Grant, a tall, lean man in his early 40s with a weathered face that bore the sun-creased lines of fieldwork. He wore a thick green canvas jacket over his flannel shirt, and his steel-blue eyes scanned the woods with scientific intensity. A field biologist and tracker, Zachary had spent 2 decades studying predator migration patterns across the Rockies. Beside him was Melissa Grant, his wife and research partner. Melissa was 5 years younger, with a sturdy frame, shoulder-length red hair pulled into a messy bun, and a face both soft and sharply observant. A wildlife ecologist, she had grown up in the Montana wilds and was known for her quiet persistence and a nearly supernatural ability to identify animal behavior from the smallest trace. She leaned forward now, watching the digital screen of their thermal imaging device. "Movement," she murmured, tapping the screen. "But not deer. Smaller, faster." Zachary squinted. "Could be lynxes again. Maybe the same trio we tracked last spring. Or a poacher's trapline," Melissa added grimly. For the past 3 weeks, scattered reports from hikers and motion-triggered trail cams had pointed to suspicious activity, disturbed game paths, foreign scents, blood trails with no clear predator pattern. The Grants had been trying to trace the source, but storms and early snowfall had wiped the trails clean. They pulled over near a turnout and began setting up a remote sensor. While Zachary adjusted the antenna, Melissa knelt to examine fresh paw prints in the slush too large for a fox, too light for a coyote. She narrowed her eyes. "Dog," she whispered. Zachary joined her, puzzled. "There shouldn't be any strays up here. Unless someone left it to die," Melissa said, her voice tightening. Back in the mountain den, Ash had deposited the pup onto a dry patch lined with pine needles and dried grass. The lynxes circled unsure. Bristle remained skeptical, sniffing the pup's legs. Creek batted gently at the pup's ear, watching as it barely moved. Then Ash did something unthinkable. She lay down, curling her powerful frame around the trembling creature. That night, as the snow deepened and the storm battered the peaks, the pup nestled into the warmth of 3 wild hearts beating around him. He did not know what they were, only that they did not leave. In the darkness, he was not alone. He would come to be called Rusty, not by the lynxes who had no need for names, but later when his story would be shared far beyond the forest. Far below, the Grants returned to their cabin, unaware that the strange hybrid of paw prints they'd found belonged not to a monster or a myth, but to a child caught between 2 worlds. The den was a hollow of stone, and silence carved into the mountain's side by time and storm. Tucked beneath a jutting ledge and draped in tangled roots, it held no fire, no warmth beyond the breath and bodies within. Here, Rusty grew not in a house, not with toys or collars or commands, but in the strange and solemn company of lynxes. Ash, the matriarch, ruled the space with an air of quiet dominion. She was large for a lynx, her silvery gray coat almost ghost-like against the snow, with eyes the color of dusk, and a walk that seemed both graceful and grounded. It was Ash who had found Rusty near the roaring stream, who had brought him into the den like an offering to the wild itself. She didn't speak, not with sound, but with a stare that said more than barking ever could. Bristle kept his distance, a scarred and solemn presence, who never fully accepted Rusty, but tolerated him with wary eyes. His tufted ears twitched at every movement, and he slept alone near the back of the den watching. If he ever felt warmth for the pup, he did not show it. Creek, youngest of the trio, became something close to a sibling. Still lean and restless, his tan-spotted coat flickered like fire through the snow as he played, wrestled, leapt. He was the first to nudge Rusty into games, the first to curl around him during cold nights when Ash was out hunting. Rusty, though not of their kind, adapted. His limbs grew long and muscular. His sable coat thickened into layers that held out even the sharpest wind. He learned to crouch low like a cat before pouncing, though his size made it comically clumsy. He learned to wait in stillness beside Ash as she stared into the woods before a hunt. He learned that in the wild, silence was not absence, it was presence waiting to be known. When the lynxes padded forward, they made no sound. Rusty, once a clumsy, paw-heavy creature, began to step lighter, hold his breath longer to listen more than speak. His bark faded, used only in dreams. In the den, they spoke with eyes, with tails, with movement. He watched Ash catch snow mice with surgical precision. He tried to do the same, springing from behind a rock landing, nose first in snowdrift. Creek would purr a low rolling sound like laughter and toss him another chance. Time passed without clocks. There was only the deepening cold, the soft fall of snow at the entrance, the warmth of bodies pressed together in a circle that made no sense and yet felt complete. Miles below the ridgeline, in a wooden cabin tucked beneath frosted pine, a girl pressed her pencil against paper with slow, deliberate strokes. Ellie Grant, aged 10, had the solemn eyes of a child who noticed more than she spoke. Her hair was a nest of brown curls, always in need of brushing, and her sweaters hung loose from her small shoulders like they'd once belonged to someone bigger. Her fingers were perpetually smudged with charcoal. Ellie drew creatures strange, impossible imagined. Not from books or screens, but from inside her. Wolves with wings, deer with stars for antlers. But lately, one creature kept returning to the page. A dog, or something like a dog. Its eyes were gentle, uncertain, its ears uneven. It stood beside large cats with thick legs and short tails. In some drawings it curled beside them. In others it walked alone in snow. She didn't know where the image came from, only that it felt familiar. Melissa, her mother, once leaned over her sketch pad. "What's that one's name?" she asked, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's forehead. "I don't know yet," Ellie replied, "but I think it lives in the mountains." Zachary, Ellie's father, had once joked that she had the forest in her head. Ellie wasn't sure if it was a compliment, but she liked the sound of it. Every morning she sat by the wide front window staring into the trees beyond their clearing. And sometimes in the early pink hours she swore she saw shapes moving between the shadows. She never told anyone. Back in the den, Rusty crouched beside Ash as she stared out into the open snowfield, motionless, her ears twitching. A mouse darted beneath the snow, and she was gone, silent, deadly. Rusty waited, then leapt after her, a second too late, a step too loud. The mouse vanished, but Ash didn't scold. She turned back, brushed against him once, and walked away. That night, Creek dropped a snow hare's ear at Rusty's feet. A gift. Rusty didn't know what to do with it, but he didn't move it either. He dreamed of warmth that wasn't fur, of hands that weren't claws, of a voice, high clear, calling a name he didn't yet have. But when he woke, all he saw was snow. All he knew was the den he belonged. Even if he didn't know how, the snow had begun to melt along the southern faces of the ridges, revealing patches of cold earth and tufts of golden grass. Spring had not yet arrived, but its scent whispered through the wind-damp pine-thawed soil, and something else, something sharp and feral. Rusty had grown stronger. No longer the trembling pup barely able to walk, he now moved with an awkward blend of feline grace and canine momentum. His muscles had thickened beneath his sable coat, his gait more fluid but still heavier than that of his lynx companions. The lynxes had accepted him not as one of their own exactly, but as something not entirely other. Creek still played with him daily, their mock fights becoming more intense, more complex. Bristle remained watchful, his trust always held just beyond reach, and Ash had shifted from nurturer to teacher. Her eyes, now sharper, expected more of him. She led him into new terrain, rocky ridges, narrow paths near cliff edges, glacial ravines, and tested him not with commands, but with distance. One morning, the four of them climbed to a high saddle between peaks. The wind tore across the pass, and clouds rolled thickly overhead. Ash was ahead scouting. Bristle lingered below. Creek darted in and out of view, chasing scents in the snow. Rusty wandered to the ridge's edge, ears perked, tail low. That was when he saw it. At first, it was only a flicker of movement among the trees far below. Then came the scent, metallic sharp, older than prey. A wolf. Alone. Rusty didn't understand the nuances of dominance or territory, but something in the air, some vibration only instinct could feel, told him to freeze. The lone wolf stepped into view larger than rusty fur matted with age and battle. Its coat was dark gray with silver streaks, and its right eye was clouded a white film over deep black. The wolf stopped, looked up. It saw him. Rusty stood still, his heart pounding, every nerve taut. The wolf did not snarl or run. It began climbing, slowly, purposefully. Rusty backed up paws, slipping on the loose scree. Creek appeared behind him, ears flat, hissing low. Ash was already moving. She appeared without a sound between the two young ones and raised her body high, not in challenge, but warning. The wolf stopped. It stood 20 feet away now, massive, breathing slow. Its head turned slightly. Its gaze locked on Rusty, not Ash, not Creek, just him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the wolf huffed through its nose, turned, and vanished into the trees again. Ash didn't move for a full minute. When she did, she bumped Rusty's shoulder sharply as if saying, "Remember this." That night, Ash led Rusty through a new route. Tight switchback sledges only inches wide, snow-thick gullies between tall rocks. She moved faster than usual. Rusty struggled to follow. She stopped atop a narrow stone spire. He hesitated. She growled, low, not unkind. He jumped. His landing was clumsy, but he made it. They stood together on the precipice, the stars far above, and the shadows of pines endless below. Rusty panted, his legs trembling, but he didn't turn away. Ash looked at him not with affection, but with approval. He had learned something. He was faster now, stronger, but he also knew he was not like them. He couldn't slink like Creek or vanish like Bristle. His muscles bunched differently. His paws struck louder. He was caught in between, and that truth lodged in his chest like a splinter. Elsewhere, miles below in the river basin, where spring thaws began earlier, Ellie Grant zipped her blue jacket all the way to her chin and knelt beside a muddy patch behind their research cabin. Her curls were pinned beneath a wool hat with stars on it. Her cheeks flushed pink from the chill. She carried a leather-bound notebook worn at the corners and bursting with scribbled pages and a small camera trap with a motion sensor. Her boots sank slightly into the soft soil as she leaned forward. There, imprinted in the earth beside a patch of disturbed snow, was something strange, two overlapping sets of tracks. One larger, heavier, with rounded pads and claw marks. The other, almost feline, smaller with no claw indentations. But both led in the same direction. Ellie's brow furrowed. She took out a ruler and began measuring. Then sketched the tracks into her notebook with quick, confident lines. She had seen mountain lion prints before. And coyote. These weren't quite either. "It's not a dog," she whispered, "but it's not a cat either." She glanced up toward the trees, the ones that thickened into dense forest just beyond the clearing. "What are you?" That night at the dinner table, Melissa poured hot tea while Zachary stirred venison stew. Ellie flipped through her notebook, unable to sit still. "I think something's out there," she said, voice low but serious. "Something we haven't cataloged." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "You think there's a new species in our backyard?" "Not new," Ellie replied. "Just wrong." Melissa glanced at her with a knowing smile. "You and your forest mysteries again." But Zachary paused. "You said the tracks were together, same direction, same spacing." Like they were walking side by side, Zachary scratched his beard. "We'll check it out tomorrow. Might just be a bobcat tracking a stray dog." Ellie shook her head. It didn't feel like that. Back in the den, Rusty lay curled beside Creek, his breath still fast from the long day. Bristle was asleep near the entrance. Ash was watching the night sky through the narrow slit between hanging roots. Rusty closed his eyes. Behind his lids he saw the wolf again, and Ash's stare, and the leap. He was becoming something, but he didn't know what. It began with a scent dry and sharp like burning pine needles long before the flames ever touched bark. Rusty was the first to smell it as he nosed along a deer trail in the low glade beneath their rocky den. The wind, once cold and clean, now carried the acrid breath of fire. At first, Ash paid it no mind. Fires were part of the forest's life, but this scent grew stronger faster than instinct could excuse. By late afternoon, the winds had shifted. Gusts rolled down from the ridgeline, pushing smoke into the valley like a tide of ghosts. Birds vanished. Rabbits darted. Creek stood at the edge of the glade, his ears twitching, tail low. Ash tensed. The fire was coming. The den had been their home for months, carved deep into a forgotten crevice surrounded by black pine and stone. But fire did not care for memories. The smoke poured fast now, curling low through the brush. Ash barked sharply, a sound she rarely made, then bounded up the slope. Bristle followed immediately. Creek darted behind, but Rusty hesitated. He stood at the mouth of the den, smoke curling around his legs. He looked back once, toward the place that had been warmth and safety, and then turned to follow. But the fire came faster than they could run. A sudden roar filled the glade as a fallen pine, dried by winter and snapped by wind, burst into flame behind them, cutting off the path. Rusty swerved, skidding in the mud, and found himself near the ravine that cradled a narrow, furious stream. The air glowed orange. Sparks danced like angry stars. Ash and Creek were already across, perched on the other side, calling in silence with their eyes. Rusty backed up, readied himself to leap. But the moment his paws left the ground, the edge beneath him crumbled. He crashed against the slope and slid downward into a patch of burning brush. The heat clawed at him, smoke thickening his lungs. He barked an old instinct, breaking through. Bristle was still on his side. For a second, the older lynx paused, staring at the dog he had barely tolerated. Then, without a sound, Bristle leapt down his large paws, scattering Ash, his body moving through the fire like shadow. He reached Rusty, clamped his teeth onto the scruff of his neck like Ash once had, and pulled. Flames licked the air behind them as Bristle dragged Rusty up the incline, but a branch snapped and fell, catching Bristle's haunch. He yowled, dropped Rusty, then pushed the pup forward with his shoulder before collapsing. Rusty scrambled up the rest of the way alone, then turned. Bristle lay beneath a blackened pine, breathing but unmoving. Far above them, headlights cut through the haze. Zachary Grant had been returning from a high-elevation trailhead, his truck loaded with camera traps and tagged data modules when he saw the smoke. He stopped near the base of the ridge and rushed into the woods on foot, his heavy boots sinking into the damp moss. Smoke stung his eyes. He didn't expect to find anything alive. And then he saw them, two shapes staggering from the tree line. One large, one lean. A dog, a wildcat. Zachary froze. The dog was scorched, limping, but upright. The lynx behind him was down, panting, fur singed. Zachary dropped to one knee. "Easy," he murmured, voice low, calming. "I won't hurt you." Rusty stared at him. For a second something old and buried flickered in his eyes, a human voice, a scent that meant safety. Zachary stepped forward slowly and removed his coat, draping it gently over Bristle's side. Rusty didn't run. He helped drag Bristle a few feet away from the fire's edge. Rusty stayed beside them the whole time, tail low, ears alert. Then Zachary noticed something, a glint of metal. He looked around, then up. His trail camera was mounted 20 feet away, pointed exactly toward the spot where Rusty now stood. Back at the cabin, Ellie huddled near the monitor with wide eyes. Her father had called ahead, told Melissa and Ellie to watch the feed in case the fire turned toward the property. The footage blinked to life, and there, through the thick fog of smoke, came a shape. Ellie leaned forward. Her breath caught. The creature she had drawn over and over, the dog with the lynx eyes. It was real. "Mom," she whispered, "it's him." Melissa came over, mouth parting in disbelief. Rusty stood in the camera's frame, smoke billowing behind him, fur-singed eyes fixed on the human behind the lens. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a myth, it was here. The temporary Wildlife Rescue Center sat on the outskirts of Silver Creek, a sleepy mountain town at the edge of civilization and wilderness. The building was modest, a long, low structure of timber and weather-worn siding built half into the hillside. Pines loomed on three sides like watchful sentries, and behind the compound stretched a patch of enclosed forest, often used for rehabilitating animals, too wild for cages but too fragile for release. Rusty was taken there the day after the fire. He had not resisted, not growled nor barked, only walked alongside Zachary with a strange resignation in his eyes, as if he understood that the world he knew had been lost to ash and smoke. His left hind leg was bruised, his coat singed in patches, and his movement slow but not broken. Inside the shelter, the staff moved cautiously around him. Rusty was an anomaly, a German shepherd by breed, but something else by behavior. Dr. Colleen Reyes, the veterinarian in charge, was the first to notice. She was in her early 50s, lean and deliberate, with gray-streaked hair tied in a no-nonsense ponytail. Her eyes were tired from years of emergency calls and late-night surgeries, but sharp enough to see what others missed. "He's not just traumatized," she said quietly after the initial checkup. "He doesn't act like a dog at all." She had tried everything, warm food, treats, toys, even soft words. But Rusty remained silent. He wouldn't eat unless placed in a secluded corner. He didn't respond to names, commands, or praise. When approached by other dogs, whether friendly or cautious, he simply turned away and climbed onto the nearest elevated surface, the top of a kennel, a rock in the outdoor run-a-perch meant for birds. He preferred to watch from above, ears alert, tail still. Zachary watched from outside the enclosure, arms folded. Beside him stood Melissa and Ellie. Melissa had taken charge of coordinating with the shelter, but it was Ellie who had said almost nothing since Rusty's arrival. Her eyes followed the animal with a kind of reverence, a recognition. "He doesn't move like them," she said softly. Melissa gave a cautious nod. "He's not really moving like anything we know." But Ellie stepped closer to the gate. Her breath fogged the wire mesh as she whispered, "He moves like a lynx." Rusty's ears twitched. He turned his head toward her, and for the first time since arriving he walked to the edge of the enclosure, slowly, deliberately, and sat. Not like a dog, like a cat, poised, spine-straight tail wrapped around one side. The next few days passed in quiet observation. Rusty kept his distance from the other dogs, ignored food unless placed in high corners, and climbed whatever he could. He seemed both alert and absent, as if his body was here. But something inside him was still walking in snow alongside ghosts. Ellie began spending hours near his enclosure. She brought her sketchbook and sat cross-legged on a nearby bench drawing. Sometimes she talked about her day, her dreams, stories she invented on the spot. She didn't ask Rusty to play or respond. She just existed near him. One afternoon, as wind rustled the spruce trees and rain threatened the distant hills, Rusty climbed onto a rock inside the enclosure and lay down. It was the same posture he had once taken in the Lynxes' den, elevated, still quietly watchful. Ellie glanced up from her sketchpad. "I know you're not like the others," she said. "And that's okay. Maybe you're meant to be something different." That night, after dinner, she approached her parents with an idea. Zachary looked up from his notes, raising one eyebrow. Melissa set down her tea. "You want to move him?" Zachary asked. "Not move," Ellie said. "Release. Not into the wild, just into the semi-wild. That special enclosure forest behind the shelter. The one you use for coyotes and bobcats." Zachary leaned back. "Ellie, he's not a wild animal. He's not a tame one either," she replied. Melissa frowned, considering. "That forest section is monitored. It has perches dense trees. It could feel more like home to him." Zachary sighed. It would need constant GPS tracking, vet check-ins, controlled entry. "Then do all of that," Ellie said, "but let him go back to the trees. Just a little." 3 days later, after paperwork and tense phone calls with the State Wildlife Board, the shelter's staff opened the back gate. Rusty didn't bolt. He didn't hesitate either. He walked with purpose, stepping into the enclosure like a memory coming back to life. He sniffed the moss scratched at a low pine, then climbed the first log pile and perched on top. The team placed a GPS collar around his neck, sleek light barely visible under his fur. From now on, every step would be tracked, every rest point recorded. Ellie stood behind the wire fence, watching. Rusty turned once and looked at her, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something that almost resembled peace. It happened quietly, like a shadow slipping between trees. One moment, Rusty was inside the semi-wild enclosure behind the rescue center, perched atop a log ears, flicking in the evening breeze. The next morning, his space was empty. A quick search of the perimeter revealed the breach. A narrow gap beneath the southern fence, low to the ground, barely enough for most dogs. But Rusty had learned from Lynxes how to move low, how to vanish without sound. The staff reviewed the infrared night cameras. At 2:13 a.m., Rusty had paced the fence for several minutes, then stopped. He crouched, ears alert. His nose twitched at something only he could sense. Then, with feline calm, he slipped beneath the wire and was gone. He left no chaos, no barking, just absence. For most, at the center, it was a code yellow, an escaped, non-aggressive animal with a GPS collar. Not urgent, not dangerous. He'd be tracked and retrieved, no harm done. But Ellie Grant knew better. She had been monitoring Rusty's GPS data through her father's login credentials. She hadn't told anyone. At first, it was just a quiet fascination, a secret project she called Subject R01 for her biology class focused on adaptive behavior and cross-species rearing. But once Rusty disappeared, it became something else. A responsibility. A promise. Ellie sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her tablet glowing softly in the dark. The red dot representing Rusty blinked steadily on the screen, moving northwest, always northwest. She scribbled notes in the corner of her biology notebook, direction, consistent with prior lynx migration routes, possibly tracking residual scent or spatial memory. She knew what it meant. He wasn't fleeing. He was returning. Rusty's route was strange to others, but familiar to him. He paused at specific bends and creeks. He stopped at trees with claw marks, old faded ones made by ash seasons ago. He lingered in hollows beneath boulders where fur still clung, caught on the wind. The scents were weaker now, thinned by time and fire and snow, but his memory filled in what his nose could not. To Rusty, it was not escape. It was belonging. The journey took 3 days. He moved mostly at night, resting under brush or shallow overhangs during the day. When rain came, he waited it out like Ash had taught him, still silent, letting the earth cover him. Each step brought him closer, not to a place, but to a feeling warmth, presence, the rhythm of a life that once was. On the fourth evening, he reached the ridge. His den was still there, hidden beneath twisted roots and half-burned pine. The fire months ago had blackened the outer stones, but inside the structure remained. Ash's scent was gone. So was Bristle's. Creek's fur had long since blown away. The place was silent, but Rusty lay down anyway. He circled once, twice, and curled into the shallow depression he once shared with them. His tail curled over his nose. His breath slowed. He was home. Back in town, Ellie watched his GPS data update. The dot had stopped moving. Hours passed. It didn't change. She didn't need confirmation. She knew exactly where he had gone. She opened her notebook and without speaking wrote a single line. Sometimes instinct takes you to survival, but the heart takes you home. The mountain breathed cold again. After days of late spring warmth, a sudden snap of weather returned snow to the upper ridgelines, painting the forest in quiet white. The sun broke through only in short intervals, casting silver light on an otherwise blue-toned world. Rusty's coat was now mottled with soot and snow, his paws raw from the stone, but his eyes were clear. He moved like one who knew his destination. Not with urgency, but with purpose. He crossed a frozen stream just before sunrise, the ice cracking under his weight but holding. The water beneath glowed green and dark, moving like a sleeping thing. On the far side, his legs sank into a bank of powder. He climbed, slowly shaking off clumps of snow from his chest and tail. The scent on the wind was faint but unmistakable ash. Old, but still alive in the branches, the moss, the trail of fur caught in bark. Midday brought obstacles. A hunter's blind abandoned, but still carrying the acidic scent of metal and sweat. Rusty circled wide. Later, he ducked under fallen limbs and crossed over ridges littered with elk bones. The wilderness was vast, filled with dangers, but Rusty moved with a strange stillness, as though the fear had burned out of him long ago. Far below, on a windswept hill just beyond the town's border, Ellie Grant sat wrapped in a wool blanket, a thermos of tea balanced beside her, and her tablet resting on her knees. Her hair was pulled back in a frizzy ponytail, and her cheeks were red from cold and worry. She had been tracking Rusty for nearly 6 days. Her parents didn't know. She told them she was working on her spring biology project, Partial Truth, but her gaze rarely left the blinking red dot moving through the map's elevation lines. This morning, something changed. The GPS marker had paused again this time for over 2 hours. Not unusual, but this time it wasn't near shelter or water. It was deep in the high country, and then it moved again, just a short distance, then paused once more. Ellie's eyes widened. "That's not sheltering," she whispered to herself. "That's waiting." She opened her field notebook and flipped to a drawing she had sketched weeks ago, a rough map of the lynx migration paths based on her father's trail data and her own deductions. The area Rusty was in now intersected with the last known coordinates of the lynxes before they vanished after the fire. It was higher ground, harder to reach, less touched by humans. A gust of wind scattered her pages, and she clutched them to her chest. Please, she thought, let it be them. Meanwhile, Rusty crested a steep slope rimmed with pine. The trees here grew tighter, older. Shadows clung to the roots. He slowed. There was something in the silence, something familiar. Then he saw her. Ash stood at the edge of a rocky overhang, her silver coat dulled with age, but still luminous beneath the clouds. Her ears perked at the sound of movement. She did not run. She watched. Rusty froze. Behind her, 2 shapes emerged. Creek, taller now, broader in the shoulders. His spots were fading, but his eyes still sparkled with mischief. And Bristle, limping slightly a notch torn in his left ear, but upright and proud. The wind shifted. Rusty stepped forward, slowly, ears back. Ash didn't blink. Then, with the smallest movement, she stepped toward him. She lowered her head, pressed her brow gently against his neck, and let out a sound, not a growl, not a purr. Something in between. Rusty leaned into her, trembling. Creek circled them both, letting out a soft chirp, brushing against Rusty's side. Bristle stayed behind watching, but he dipped his head. They were not the same as before. They were older, tired, but they were whole. Ellie saw it all through her binoculars from across a distant slope. She had hiked through mud and brush that morning, following Rusty's trail as close as she dared without alerting authorities. When she crested the ridge and spotted the movement in the clearing below, she nearly dropped her gear. There, between the trees, stood 4 figures. 3 lynxes. 1 dog. They weren't playing. They weren't fighting. They were simply together. Ellie lowered the binoculars slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Handshaking, they found each other." Against everything weather-distant species, they found their way home. In the clearing, Rusty curled against Ash side to side. Creek lay nearby, tail flicking. Bristle kept guard from a Rock-Eye's alert. The snow began to fall again, dusting them all in white. But none of them moved. They had already arrived. The forest had changed subtly but permanently. Where once the burned ridge was a forgotten line of ash and ruin, now it held life, and more than that, it held meaning. Months had passed since Rusty's return to the Lynxes. The GPS collar, which had once blinked urgently with escape alerts, now pulsed calmly from a dedicated console in a small wooden building nestled near the base of the valley. A brass plaque above its entrance read, "Interwild Harmony Project." Observation Station EO1, the station had once been a ranger shed used for storing firebreak equipment. Now it had become a hub for scientists, rangers, and students. It was painted forest green, lined with solar panels, and fitted with 2 large outdoor motion cameras, both pointed at the distant glade where the 4 animals had made their home. From a distance, the creatures looked like shadows between trees. But those who knew what they were seeing understood this was something unprecedented. Rusty sat each morning on the highest stonehead, held high posture, watchful. Around him, the lynxes moved with familiar grace. Ash was slower now, but dignified, her coat silvering like old bark. Creek had grown bold and rangy, often leading short excursions toward the edge of their known territory. Bristle remained sentinel, always slightly apart, always watching. From the station window, Dr. Helena Morrison, the lead zoologist on the project, observed through binoculars. In her early 60s, Helena had a wiry frame and wore thick-rimmed glasses perpetually smudged with dust. Her hair was cut short and practical, a mix of salt and pepper, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent more time in tents than offices. She had first joined the Grant family weeks after the footage of Rusty's reunion went viral within the conservation community. Helena was skeptical at first. Decades in wildlife research had made her wary of stories that sounded too much like fables. But now, standing at the console with data arrays showing synchronized movement patterns between Rusty and the lynxes, she murmured aloud, "It's not a fluke. It's a bond. Cross-species attachment built through shared trauma and proximity, but solidified by choice." Zachary Grant stood beside her. His arms crossed, a satisfied half-smile on his face. "Told you he wasn't just a confused dog." Melissa, nearby, adjusted a camera lens trained on the far ridge. "He's not confused at all. He knows exactly where he belongs." Ellie, now 12, had grown taller, her frame lanky and her curls still wild. She spent almost every weekend at the station carrying her backpack of sketch pads and field journals. Her latest essay, titled Rusty Between Worlds, had won first place in the National Junior Naturalist Competition. The judges had called it a stunning fusion of observation, empathy, and scientific insight. But Ellie didn't care about the prize. She only cared about what she saw each morning when the mist lifted from the ridge, 4 silhouettes, dog and lynxes, together like a single shape cut from the same story. At a public presentation held beneath a canvas canopy near the station, Helena stood at a podium and addressed a group of visiting students, rangers, and wildlife officials. This isn't just about 1 dog or 3 cats. It's about the potential to rethink what we believe about instinct, about species boundaries, and about belonging. The Interwild Harmony Project will become a long-term research initiative not just to study Rusty and the lynxes, but to create a space where unusual animal behavior is not just observed, but protected. A hand went up in the audience, a ranger named Mark Devlin, tall and broad, with a thick beard and sunburned skin. So we're not trying to bring him back. Gin, Helena shook her head. No. Rusty isn't a rescue. He's a resident. A gentle ripple of approval passed through the crowd. Afterward, Ellie guided a few younger students through the observation deck, pointing to the small blips on the live tracker. That's Bristle. See how he always stays near the outer edge. He's the one who used to be the most aggressive. But now he lets Rusty take lead if danger's near. That's trust. A boy asked, "How do you know all that?" Ellie just smiled. Because I watched. Every day. Later that evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold across the snow-dusted treetops, Rusty sat atop his rock. His ears twitched at every shift in the forest, every bird call, every creak of snow under hoof. Ash lay curled nearby, her breathing soft. Creek was grooming his tail with lazy swipes. Bristle watched the sky. In the stillness, the 4 creatures looked not like anomalies, but like keepers of a shared truth. A truth beyond words. From the station window, Ellie looked up, then lifted her pencil and began a new sketch. She drew the silhouette of a shepherd dog seated beside 3 lynxes. She shaded the trees behind them, added a rising moon. And across the bottom of the page she wrote, "Some borders aren't meant to be guarded. They're meant to be crossed together." Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles don't come as thunder or light. Sometimes they arrive on quiet paws in the shape of a creature that doesn't fit any mold, yet finds its place through love. Rusty was never meant to survive, not by the rules of nature, not by the judgment of men. And yet he did. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he was chosen by a family of another kind, and perhaps by something far greater than we can see. In the stillness of the wild, he found something more powerful than instinct. He found belonging. Maybe that's what God does for us, too. He sees past our differences, our scars, our strangeness, and gives us a place where we are loved not for what we are, but for who we are. Family isn't just blood. It's where your soul is accepted without question. So when you feel like you don't fit, or when the world tells you you don't belong, remember Rusty. Remember the dog raised by lynxes. Remember the Creator who made even that story possible. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories like this, and may God bless you for believing in the miracles of love, courage, and second chances. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that family is where love lives, no matter the shape it takes.